Hello and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today I want to do two things. One, I want to talk a little bit more about Helsinki Longsword Open 2025, but two, I want to talk about the Americans in attendance there and try to showcase the fact that we had a really great showing at this tournament. Now, one thing about Helsinki that you probably already knew is that it was one of, if not the most highly rated longsword tournaments of all time. But the reason it was the most highly rated might be a little bit confusing. It wasn't just because it had some of the highest rated longsword fencers in the world in attendance, like Miro Latela and Ville Valimaki, but because on average, the rating of the people in the bracket was above 1400. Now to put that a little bit in perspective, generally, if you were to have a 1400 ELO rating in longsword in the world, you're probably in the top 10% of all fighters ever. And that's a really crazy thing to consider, to think that there were almost 95, 96 plus people in the tournament bracket out Helsinki, and there were very few people who were below 1400, meaning that if you got into the bracket at Helsinki, you were fighting the top 10% in the world every single time. Your easiest fight, your lowest rated fight in that bracket was still probably someone who would absolutely stomp the average club all over the world. And that's a really incredible thing to consider. So when I say that there are more than a handful of Americans that made it not only into the bracket, but somewhat far into the bracket at Helsinki, I think that's more of an achievement than it would perhaps seem to be on first glance. Now, to get into a little bit more depth on the specific people I'm talking about, I have these 10 names listed. And I want to say, first of all, if I missed your name because you're from America, but you maybe have a very European sounding name, I'm really sorry that I missed you. I tried as hard as I could to comb through and find all of the Americans' fights, both by reading the bracket and by watching the footage. But if I still managed to miss you, super sorry about that. Send me a message. But these are the 10 people that I managed to find. Now, in this particular little spreadsheet, I have two columns. One is the rating before Helsinki, and one is the rating after. Now, we were lucky enough to have HEMA ratings process Helsinki's rating changes almost instantly, which means I get to know how each of the Americans did, not only in terms of how they were when they entered, but how they were when they left. Now, one thing you're going to notice here is, like I said at the beginning, every single one of these American fighters is over 1400. And that means that they're in the top 10% in the world. But there is a pretty big difference between something like a 1400 ELO and a 1700 ELO. Once you get into the 1700s, you go from the top 10% to the top 1%. So as you can see here, there are a couple names here who are not only in the top 10% of the world and would likely, be guaranteed a spot in the bracket, but there are some who are in the top 1%, which might mean they are in contestation for getting the final prize. Now, none of these people ended up making it past the top 8, which is a shame, but it doesn't mean that they perform badly. It does mean they perform very well. Now, in the background, I'm going to be having some of these elimination fights playing, but what I want to talk about more specifically is an overall trend in what we see from the before rating and the after rating. Specifically, that some people went up and some people went down, but one thing that's very careful to consider is nobody gained or lost anything close to 100 ELO. This means that, for the most part, everybody performed under their expected outcomes. Nobody went in with a 1700 rating and beat Anthony Olbritsky. Nobody went in with a 1400 rating and lost to somebody with a 900 rating. There were no real crazy upsets, at least insofar as it was enough to influence their rating. However, that doesn't mean that the upsets didn't happen. It just meant that they were within a little bit of a bracketed range where it wasn't too insane. One thing you have to consider when you're talking about HEMA ratings is that the difference of 100 ELO can be pretty huge in some areas and pretty small in others. The difference between a 1400 and a 1500 is fairly negligible, but the difference between a 1700 and an 1800 is often the difference between a top 50 and a top 10. So a huge measured difference there. Now, HEMA Ratings does a pretty good job of taking this kind of thing into account, but what it means is that when you see something like Aaron Carnuta go from 1734 to 1741, what that basically means is that he performed very well, beating most of his opponents, but maybe lost to somebody who was right at about his level, and that's something you could expect. A lot of the things about ELO is that it often takes more into account who you beat over the course of the day, as opposed to what part of the day you were in when you won or lost. Theoretically, you could have gotten all the way to the finals, beating nothing but 1,400 people rated lower than you, and then lost to the best in the world and still gained a whole bunch of ELO. Similarly, you could have lost a bunch in your pool matches, gotten super far in the bracket, but it didn't matter because all those losses in the pool took too much of your ELO away from you. Now, if we want to have a conversation about the overall topic of who is better, American fencers or European fencers, the answer is actually pretty clear. Of the people who are on my list here, they are not really the highest rated fencers even at this tournament. There were a whole lot of people who were 1,700 plus, and someone like Sam Riles, who is very highly rated, was somewhere in the middle of the pack as far as contestation for winning the whole thing. There were a whole lot of people who pushed the 1800s, and there were a whole lot of people who were even higher than him in the 1700s that would have given him a real serious run for his money. As the highest rated person there, though, you would think that the kind of person he would lose to was someone who was significantly better than him, but in this case, that wasn't really what happened. And this brings up a topic that a lot of people talk about when it comes to HEMA rating, which is inaccurate ratings. As you know, HEMA ratings does your rating based on the people you fight, but there are a lot of places out there where you don't have much of an opportunity to fight people from different ratings, from different countries, from different parts of the world. For example, if you live in Australia, there's really nowhere you can go to fence somebody from Norway. You have to travel thousands of miles and you have to spend thousands of dollars just to get there, only to find out that you might not be on the level. And when I say that there is a difference between the level of European HEMA and American HEMA, what I really mean is that having something like a 1,700 rating in America might mean something different than having a 1,700 rating in Europe. And there is a big outlier that happened at this particular tournament that sort of enforces that idea. The person who won the tournament, who won Helsinki Open 2025, was only rated about 1,500. They were far from the rating of some of the higher level people. And while that is, of course, a statistical outlier for someone with that low of a rating, relatively speaking, to win that tournament, it does help illuminate the fact that some people have artificially low ratings for how well they perform, and some people might have artificially high ratings for how they perform. It could be something as simple as the rule set, the venue, the fact that they were jet lagged, or just the fact that somebody had their number. And sometimes when you get into a pool of sharks, there isn't enough of a difference between a high-rated fencer and a low-rated fencer to guarantee an outcome. Even if you have a 60-40 chance at winning, that's still a 40% chance that you lose to someone who HEMA rating says you shouldn't. So to use a really specific example, myself, I'm a mid-1700 rated fighter, and I imagine that if I were to go to Europe and compete in all the circuits that are happening over there where I could fight other 1700 rated people, I'd probably do okay, but I don't think I would perform at the level that my HEMA rating says I would. I think there are more than a few 1500, 1600 rated fighters over in Europe who are probably better than me, and as a result, I would lose a bunch of HEMA rating if I went over there and started competing. As a result, I can say that I have a slightly more artificial HEMA rating because one of the reasons I get so many ELO every time I go to a tournament is that if I sweep my pool and I maybe only lose once in the bracket, it doesn't matter if I won the whole tournament, got second place, or got lost in the top 16. All that matters is that the people I beat were lower than me, and the person I lost to was close enough to my level that it didn't really matter. That means that there's a concept here in the world of HEMA ratings where you can essentially farm lower level people to get a really high rating. And sometimes it's not intentional and sometimes it is. But overall, if we're going to have a conversation about whether Americans or Europeans are better, we have to just look at the fact that Europeans have a tighter concentration of higher level fencers that are within flying distance and driving distance and tournament distance, which means that they get way more exposure to the other high-level fencers of their region than we do here in America. Now, on the flip side of this conversation is the reality that I have actually fenced almost over half of the people on this list. Now, you might think that that means we're in a tight little bubble of a pool, and that means that maybe we all have a slightly inflated rating. However, everybody who went to this tournament performed, as the numbers show, pretty much within spec of what they were expected to perform. And what that means is that their HEMA rating is actually pretty accurate. And that's pretty crazy to think about, considering that a lot of the people on this list are not only from America, from the East Coast, but from Ohio specifically. The idea that you could go to one state in one country and get 4 or 5 people who would perform well at Helsinki is crazy to think about. And what it means is that while there is a possibility that people can farm lower level fighters in their community and get an artificially high HEMA rating, there is also evidence here that if you do have a couple of high level people in your community and you fence them on a regular basis, you all get better. And this is the only real conclusion to pull from this, because someone like Sam Riles, Colin McConnell, Thomas Kessler, and Ethan Adkins, who again are all within, I think, an hour's drive of each other as far as where they practice, can all fight each other on such a regular enough basis that they've all improved themselves and their HEMA rating. It also means that if you have to keep fighting Sam Riles at the top of your bracket, chances are you're going to only be able to catch up to his rating if you're able to beat him at least 50 or 40% of the time. So what this means is that while America might have a little bit of ways to go to catch up to European HEMA, I don't think it's as far as some people think. We are starting to form some really tight and really experienced tournament communities here in America, and again, specifically Ohio. And as a result, we are gathering a group of people who can go international and still do really well. And that means that while the curse of COVID has still crushed a lot of American HEMA, it's starting to blossom back, and it might be blossoming back fast enough that it can catch up to and maybe even overtake European HEMA. Now, the other thing to consider here is how the Europeans fared. And as I mentioned earlier, there were 2 really high-level people who were in the top 4 of Helsinki last year who did not do as well as maybe they would have expected to. Miro Latela and Ville Välimäki both lost to people who were rated under them. And while Ville got all the way, I believe, into the top 4, Miro had a really bad fight in the earliest part of the bracket and lost in the second round. Now, when I watch his fight, and it's one I'm going to review later, it's not necessarily that Miro just had a bad day, but specifically that he fought somebody who was very antithetical to his style of fencing. Now, how this pertains to European fencing overall is that it once again tells a little bit of a story about how the fact that when you attend the highest rated longsword tournament of all time, nobody you fight is an easy fight. And it could be that someone like Miro and someone like Ville, who are, again, rated much higher than a lot of these people, might be experiencing some HEMA ratings bloat. It might be that even though they are a part of this global community, they have only just started to compete internationally, and as a result, they have a whole lot of wins under their belt of people who are considered much lower rated than them, but maybe not so many wins against people who are within that 200 meter range, that 200 rating range. It's really tough to get a gauge on how someone will perform on a given day, and if the world of fighting is anything to go off of, everybody has a really good day and everybody can have a really bad day, and it's easy to just chalk up Miro's loss to having a bad day. It's probably what's most accurate. But at the same time, what you have to consider is that there are a lot of 1,500, 1,600 rating people who just are flying under the radar because they are also entering the first vestiges of their international tournament career. And as a result, this was the first chance they had to really showcase how they fought. As a result, I believe that a lot of these high-level people are going to have some more adaptations that they have to make to the styles of these new and up-and-coming fencers, but they just didn't have a chance to do it until now because they had never met before at a tournament. So, in conclusion, believe it or not, having the highest rated longsword tournament of all time was likely going to showcase some of the best fencing around, but maybe you might have felt a little bit disappointed by the fact that some of your heroes in the world of HEMA tournaments didn't make it all the way to the finals. And to that I say, this is the perfect opportunity to adapt. If you're an American and you went to Helsinki and you were a little disappointed that you couldn't get all the way to the end, make sure to try to adapt to the European fighting style that you experienced there, because when you come back home, you're not going to experience it much for a while, and you have to put in a lot of effort if you're going to replicate it in your training partners and in yourself. Similarly, if you were one of the big names in the European HEMA circuit and you didn't do as well as you thought you were going to, make sure to adapt to the style that you were beaten by. Because regardless of whether or not you think that there is a monolithic European HEMA fighting style, there really isn't. And they're experiencing some of the same growing pains that we are over here in America. There are pockets of people who have been sparring for quite a while and are actually quite good and maybe even better than their rating, who have just never gone to an international tournament like this. And the first time they show up, they're going to make waves because every fight they have and every fight they win is going to look like a big upset. So, if you want to get better and you want to travel internationally, you have to watch these international tournament fights and you have to be able to learn from them. Similarly, you also have to know how to cultivate an international level community within the group of people that you can reach. You have to be able to take this kind of footage back to your own club and say, we have to train to beat these people, even though we may never meet them. Because if we don't train to beat them, it means that when we do inevitably send somebody from our community over there, they're not going to be prepared. They have to be prepared to fight not just in the circuit that they're familiar with, but the circuit overall. And you might find that if you continue to get better and better and use footage from other places, that when you make your debut on the international stage, you're going to be one of those people to cause a big upset. So, I'm going to be talking more about Helsinki in the coming weeks and covering more of those individual fights. But for now, that is all I'm going to talk about, and I will see you next week.